The custom black marble table filling the penthouse boardroom cost more than the annual revenue of the companies funding it. A seamless slab of Italian stone. It reflected the desperate, sweating faces of the Sterling family seated along its edge. Each offering had been presented with desperate precision. 6 months of audited financials, transferred offshore accounts, and the family's most favored children, offered up by a patriarch who treated his offspring like poker chips in a high-stakes game. Richard Sterling sat near the center in a damp tailored suit. His posture was usually a weapon, but tonight, his arrogance was dissolving into fear. 6 decades he had spent perfecting the art of owning every room he entered. Tonight, he looked like a man watching his empire burn. The offerings laid out before the boss were impressive. A charismatic eldest brother holding the keys to a lucrative Silicon Valley tech firm. A beautiful younger sister, groomed since birth for high society, fluent in 3 languages and draped in designer silk. These were not just offspring. These were the Sterling family's trophies, polished and pushed into the light to settle an unpayable blood debt. The pitch had lasted for 40 minutes. Hollow promises and frantic negotiations floated across the black marble like smoke. Every Sterling performing a desperate version of themselves for a man who had not yet spoken a single word. He was perfectly, terrifyingly silent. Welcome to Afro-love Underworld. If you are new here, settle in, because these dark romance stories do not hold back. Hit that subscribe button, tap the bell so you never miss a redemption arc, and drop your location in the comments. Now, let us continue. Hwang Joon-Seo's hand rested calmly on the marble. He sat at the head of the table, sleek black suit, sharp posture, exuding a quiet dominance that sucked the oxygen from the room. His weathered advisor stood behind him, watchful and still. Joon-Seo didn't look at the deeds. He didn't look at the beautiful sister or the Ivy League brother. His dark, calculating eyes bypassed the trophies entirely and landed on the far, dim corner of the room. Layla Sterling sat withdrawn from the family that had always rejected her. Alert, intelligent, her hand resting against her chest in a tight grip. She wasn't performing. She was bracing for the end. Joon-Seo's finger tapped the table once. None of them, he said, his voice a quiet command that shattered the room. He pointed to the shadows. I will take her. The ride from the Sterling building was a masterclass in suffocation. For 45 minutes, the interior of the armored Maybach offered nothing but the hum of tires and the overwhelming gravity of the man seated beside her. Hwang Joon-Seo did not speak. He did not look at her. He simply existed in his tailored black suit, exuding a quiet, absolute control that made the air feel too thin to breathe. Layla kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, her back rigid against the leather. Her family had traded her without a second thought, discarding her the way they always had, but this time, the buyer was the most dangerous man in the city. She expected to be dragged into a basement. She expected immediate, physical cruelty. Instead, she was being driven through towering wrought iron gates into a sprawling, modern fortress hidden deep in the hills. The vehicle glided to a halt. The door was opened by a silent guard and the cool night air rushed in. Joon-Seo stepped out first, adjusting his cuffs with fluid, deliberate movements. Layla followed, forcing her legs to steady, her heels clicking softly against the pristine cobblestone. She stood before the estate, a monolithic structure of glass, steel, and dark stone. It was a gilded cage, breathtakingly beautiful and entirely impenetrable. Beside Joon-Seo stood the older, weathered advisor from the boardroom, his sharp eyes assessing Layla not as a helpless victim, but as a complicated puzzle piece he hadn't yet figured out where to place. Show her inside, Joon-Seo instructed the older man, his voice low, a velvet-wrapped blade. He finally turned his dark, calculating gaze to her. It was the same look that had stripped her father of his pride an hour ago. You will be shown to your quarters. Do not leave them until you are summoned. Layla lifted her chin. Years of being the Sterling family's forgotten scapegoat had built an invisible fortress around her own heart. She was terrified, her pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. She met his stare, holding his gaze for one breathless second before giving a short, stiff nod. Something shifted in Joon-Seo's expression, a microscopic tightening of his jaw, a flicker of genuine intrigue. She wasn't weeping like her beautiful sister would have. She wasn't begging like her brother. She was simply bracing for the war to come. Inside, the estate was an echoing expanse of minimalist wealth. The advisor led her up a floating staircase to a massive suite that smelled of cedar and expensive linen. When the heavy door clicked shut behind her, Layla was left entirely alone. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the darkened, heavily guarded grounds. She had been taken to settle a blood debt, expected to break under the weight of a ruthless syndicate boss. But as she touched the cold glass, her survival instinct locked into place. They thought she was weak because she was the one nobody wanted. She would learn the rules of his world, and she would survive this, just as she had survived her family. Morning arrived not with warmth, but with the cold, sterile light of dawn bleeding through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Layla had not slept. She sat perfectly still in the velvet armchair, tracking the rotation of the armed guards patrolling the manicured perimeter. For men, changing shifts every 2 hours, precise to the minute. By the time the heavy oak door to her suite clicked open, she had already memorized the estate's blind spots. The man who entered was not Hwang Joon-Seo. It was the older, weathered advisor from the boardroom. He carried a silver tray holding a single porcelain teacup and a leather-bound tablet, moving with the silent efficiency of a man who had survived decades in a lethal industry. He set the tray on the glass table between them. "Drink," he said, his voice carrying the rough texture of gravel. "You will need your wits about you if you intend to survive this house." Layla did not reach for the cup. She kept her eyes locked on his, studying the deep lines etched around his mouth and the calculating stillness of his posture. "I survived the Sterling house," she replied, her tone perfectly flat. "I imagine the rules here are simply more honest." A microscopic spark of amusement flared in the older man's eyes. He sat opposite her, waking the tablet screen. He didn't introduce himself, but Layla knew exactly what he was, the architect behind the throne. "Your father believes he purchased his life by handing you over," the advisor noted, casually swiping through a spreadsheet of acquired Sterling assets. He tilted the screen just enough for the glare to fade, perhaps a test, perhaps an oversight. "He offered us 3 shipping ports and a tech firm. We are currently liquidating them." Layla caught a brief glimpse of the columns. Her mind, honed by years of quietly analyzing the family that ignored her, processed the data instantly. She leaned forward, the faintest shadow of defiance touching her features. "You're bleeding the wrong accounts," she said quietly. The advisor's hand stopped moving. The silence in the room thickened, heavy and absolute. "Excuse me. The tech firm is a hollow front. My brother uses it to absorb toxic debt to keep his personal portfolios clean," Layla stated, her voice devoid of fear, anchored instead in cold, hard fact. "If you want the liquid assets, the real money my father thinks he hid from you, you need to look at the offshore shell company registered under my sister's middle name in the Caymans. It's where he funnels the untraceable revenue." The older man stared at her for a long, drawn-out moment. He looked at the tablet, then back at the woman his boss had demanded as payment. The Sterling family had thrown her to the wolves, completely blind to the fact that they had just handed Hwang Joon-Seo the exact weapon needed to dismantle them from the inside out. The advisor closed the tablet with a soft, deliberate click. "I see," he murmured, his gaze shifting from cautious observation to profound respect. He stood, offering a slight, formal bow that he had certainly not offered her family. "I will inform the boss that his investment is already yielding returns." The summons came at exactly 8 in the evening. Layla was escorted by 2 silent guards through the sprawling estate to a pair of heavy mahogany doors. When they opened, she stepped into Hwang Joon-Seo's private study. The room was a cavern of dark wood, lined with books and smelling of expensive scotch and impending violence. Joon-Seo sat behind a massive desk, illuminated only by the glow of the leather-bound tablet his advisor had carried that morning. He did not look up when the doors clicked shut behind her. He let the silence stretch, a deliberate tactic designed to let her anxiety suffocate her. Layla stood in the center of the Persian rug, refusing to fidget. Her family had always taught her that showing fear was the equivalent of bleeding in shark-infested waters. Finally, Joon-Seo set the tablet down. He stood, buttoning his suit jacket with slow, measured precision, and walked around the desk. He did not stop at a polite distance. He closed the space between them until he was mere inches away, his towering frame casting a long, predatory shadow over her. The air grew impossibly thin. Layla forced her breathing to remain even, though her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. My advisor tells me you possess a surprisingly sharp memory for offshore accounts, Joon-Seo said, his voice a low, silken threat. He tilted his head, his dark eyes searching her face for the microscopic tremors of terror he was so accustomed to extracting from his enemies. It took you less than 24 hours to hand me the knife to gut your father's remaining legacy. Why? Because he handed me to you to save it, Layla replied evenly. Her voice did not shake. She kept her gaze locked entirely on his, refusing to drop her chin or avert her eyes. A transaction was made. I am simply clarifying the terms. Joon-Seo stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the cold radiating from his absolute authority. He raised a hand, his knuckles lightly grazing the line of her jaw. It was not a caress, it was a physical calculation, a test to see if she would flinch away from the monster her family had sold her to. Layla's muscles locked, her deep-seated trust issues screaming at her to step back, but she anchored her heels into the floor. She did not blink. She did not retreat. A woman who betrays her blood so easily is a dangerous investment, he murmured, his thumb resting dangerously close to her pulse. A family that sells its blood has no right to demand loyalty, Layla countered, the icy detachment in her tone matching his own. For a breathless second, the Mafia boss simply stared at her. Then his hand dropped. The suffocating pressure in the room shifted, not into warmth, but into something far more dangerous, profound intrigue. He turned his back to her, walking back toward his desk. You will dine with me tomorrow night, he commanded quietly. It was not a request. It was an acknowledgement that the pawn had just become a player. The delivery arrived precisely at noon. It was a matte black garment box, holding the dark emerald silk dress Hwang Joon-Seo had mandated she wear for their impending dinner. But as Layla peeled back the layers of crisp tissue paper, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic hidden in the lining. It was a slim, silver burner phone. She stared at the device as it vibrated silently against the cardboard. A single, encrypted text message illuminated the screen. We know you are terrified. Find the ledger for his eastern shipping routes. Send the port schedules, and we will find a way to bring you home. It was her brother's syntax. Arrogant, demanding, and utterly detached from reality. Layla felt a cold, hollow sensation settle in her chest, quickly replaced by the sharp, undeniable edge of clarity. Her family had traded her like a defective pawn to save their own lives, yet they still believed they held her leash. They assumed she was cowering in a corner, desperate for the scraps of their rescue, completely blind to the fact that the cage they had banished her to was the first place she had ever been allowed to stand her ground. They wanted her to spy on the apex predator of the Korean underworld, assuming her blind loyalty to the Sterling name would override her survival instinct. It was their first fatal mistake. She did not delete the message. She did not panic, nor did she attempt to hide the device beneath the floorboards. Instead, Layla picked up the phone, her expression a mask of absolute, chilling calm. She draped the emerald silk dress perfectly over her arm and walked out of her suite. She found the weathered advisor standing at the end of the long, sunlit corridor, precisely where she knew he would be monitoring her floor. His sharp eyes tracked her approach, immediately assessing the silver object in her hand. Layla did not hesitate. She walked directly up to him and held the device out, the screen still glowing with her brother's treasonous demand. My brother is a fool, Layla stated, her voice steady and entirely devoid of familial warmth. He assumes I am a willing spy, which means he assumes your security is porous enough to exploit. You need to change the encryption protocols on your Eastern port communications immediately. He is looking for a blind spot. The older man took the phone, his gaze dropping to the text before lifting slowly back to her face. For a moment, the silence in the corridor was absolute. Then a slow, dangerous smile touched the corners of the advisor's weathered eyes. He recognized exactly what she had just done. She hadn't just surrendered contraband, she had severed her final tie to her bloodline and aligned herself with the House of Hwang. "I will inform the boss," the advisor murmured, bowing his head slightly in a new, genuine show of respect. He will be highly anticipating dinner. The emerald silk dress felt less like a garment and more like armor as Layla followed the armed escort into the estate's cavernous formal dining room. The space was an intimidating display of wealth and shadow, centered around a long mahogany table where the architects of the city's underworld were already seated. Conversations ceased the moment she crossed the threshold. 10 pairs of calculating eyes locked onto her, stripping away the silk to measure the value of the Sterling family's discarded collateral. Hwang Joon-Seo sat at the head of the table, a portrait of lethal composure in a dark, impeccably tailored suit. He did not rise, nor did he offer a welcoming smile. He simply extended 2 fingers, indicating the empty chair directly to his right, a position of dangerous proximity. The message to the room was clear: she was his acquisition, his prize, and his ultimate test. Layla walked the length of the room without hurrying. She kept her chin parallel to the floor, her spine perfectly straight, refusing to shrink beneath the predatory weight of their stares. As she took her seat, the man across from her, a rival underboss with a jagged scar cutting through his eyebrow, leaned forward, his smile sharp and mocking. "I must admit, Hwang, I expected the Sterling patriarch to send the pretty sister," the man drawled, swirling his whiskey. He shifted his dark gaze to Layla, the insult hanging heavy in the quiet room. "Tell me, little bird, does your family know how long birds last in this kind of cage before they break their own wings in a panic?" The table fell dead silent. Beside her, Joon-Seo did not intervene. He leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes watching Layla with an intense, burning curiosity. He was waiting to see if she would bleed. Layla did not look away from the scarred man. She reached forward, her hand completely steady, and picked up her crystal water glass. "My family built their cage out of hollow debt and arrogance," she said, her voice dropping into a register of cool, absolute certainty. "They are currently bleeding out because they fundamentally underestimated the architecture of this room. I suggest you don't make the exact same miscalculation by mistaking me for them." She took a slow, deliberate sip of her water and set the glass down. The crystal clinked against the wood, the only sound in a room that had just collectively stopped breathing. The scarred man's mocking smile vanished, replaced by a sudden, wary tension. Further down the table, a few of the lieutenants exchanged cautious glances. Layla hadn't just deflected an insult, she had surgically dismantled his attempt to diminish her, using the exact cold logic of their ruthless trade. Beside her, the suffocating aura surrounding Joon-Seo shifted. A low, dark sound rumbled in his chest, a laugh, brief and exceedingly rare. He reached out, his large hand wrapping over the back of her chair, physically claiming her space at the table. He wasn't just shielding her, he was elevating her. The pawn had successfully taken the center of the board, and the apex predator of the room was completely captivated. The heavy oak clock in the corner of the study ticked past midnight, the only sound in a room thick with the scent of aged scotch and impending ink. Layla sat in the leather wingback chair near the fire, a silent fixture in Hwang Joon-Seo's private domain. Since the dinner, he had not confined her to her suite. Instead, he required her presence here, quietly testing her ability to exist in the high-stakes vacuum of his daily operations. At the massive desk, Joon-Seo and his weathered advisor were reviewing a towering stack of contracts. It was a lucrative territory agreement drafted by the scarred underboss who had mocked Layla days prior. The deal promised a seamless expansion of Joon-Seo's eastern shipping routes, and the advisor had spent the last 2 hours verifying the margins. Layla had spent that same time quietly observing the reflection of the documents in the polished glass of the coffee table, her mind automatically dissecting the legal jargon she had spent years analyzing to fix her father's sloppy corporate mistakes. Joon-Seo reached for his gold fountain pen. He uncapped it with a smooth, deliberate motion, the nib hovering over the signature line. "Don't sign Section 4, Layla said. Her voice was soft, yet it cut through the heavy silence like a scalpel. Joon-Seo's hand stopped a millimeter above the parchment. He did not reprimand her for speaking out of turn. Instead, he slowly turned his dark, penetrating gaze toward her, the pen still poised in his grip. "Give me one reason why," he commanded, his tone a low, dangerous purr. Layla stood, her movements unhurried, and walked to the edge of his desk. She leaned over the mahogany, her proximity bringing the faint scent of her vanilla perfume into the sterile air of his business. She tapped a manicured nail against a densely packed paragraph buried at the bottom of the 4th page. "Subsection C," she stated, her eyes locked on his rather than the paper. "The liability clause is tethered to a floating maritime tariff, not a fixed syndicate rate. Your rival isn't granting you access to his ports. He's legally restructuring the agreement, so your syndicate automatically absorbs the federal penalties for his contraband. If the authorities seize his fleet next month, the financial hemorrhage defaults to you. You'll lose $30 million by the end of the quarter." The weathered advisor immediately pulled the document toward him, his sharp eyes darting across the microscopic print. A tense, breathless second passed before the older man swore softly in Korean. He looked up at Joon-Seo, giving a grim, confirming nod. Joon-Seo set the gold pen down. The metallic click echoed in the quiet room. He did not look at the contract. He looked solely at Layla. The cold, calculating barrier he kept between himself and the rest of the world fractured slightly, revealing a burning, territorial possessiveness. Her family had treated her as a shadow, a worthless afterthought to be kept in the dark. They had been entirely blind to the fact that shadows see absolutely everything. "It seems," Joon-Seo murmured, his voice dropping an octave as his hand brushed against her knuckles resting on his desk, "you are worth far more than the debt I took you for." Rain battered the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate's sprawling library, turning the glass into sheets of dark, weeping water. Layla sat curled in the corner of a deep leather sofa, a thick dossier resting on her lap. She had spent the last 5 hours mapping out the financial vulnerabilities of the scarred underboss, a task she had taken upon herself after dismantling his contract. The ambient temperature in the massive room was unforgiving, and a slight tremor ran through her shoulders, though her eyes remained fiercely locked on the numbers. The heavy oak doors opened without a sound. Hwang Joon-Seo stepped into the dim light, having just returned from a brutal syndicate meeting meant to address the fallout of the severed deal. His suit jacket was unbuttoned, his tie discarded, and the lethal, suffocating energy that usually surrounded him was tempered by a rare, bone-deep exhaustion. He stopped near the threshold when he saw her. He had expected her to be safely locked away in her suite, insulating herself from the terrifying reality of his world. Instead, she was sitting in the dark, fortifying his empire. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the vintage rugs. Layla looked up, her posture instantly stiffening. Her survival instinct demanded she mask her fatigue behind a wall of cool, impenetrable composure. She braced herself for a demand, a question, or a test. But Joon-Seo did not ask for a report. He stopped beside the sofa and reached down, gently sliding the heavy dossier from her stiff fingers. He set it on the glass table, moving with a slow, deliberate grace that completely contradicted his violent reputation. "The war will still be there tomorrow," he murmured. His voice was stripped of its usual commanding edge, dropping into a low, rough register that vibrated in the quiet room. Before Layla could process the shift in his tone, Joon-Seo shrugged off his suit jacket. The fabric was lined with heavy silk and carried the faint, intoxicating scent of rain, sandalwood, and gunmetal. He leaned forward and draped it securely over her shoulders. The heavy warmth of the material instantly cut the chill that had been sinking into her bones, enveloping her in his scent and his protection. Layla froze. Her pulse stuttered, caught entirely off guard. Her blood relatives had never offered her warmth. They had only ever taken, leaving her out in the cold to survive the elements alone. Now, this man, a ruthless predator who ruled by fear, was treating her with a quiet, unprompted care she had never experienced. She looked up at him, her hardened shell fracturing just a fraction to reveal the bewildered vulnerability beneath. Joon-Seo didn't retreat back to his cold distance. He sank onto the sofa beside her, close enough that the heat of his body became a palpable anchor. Slowly, he lifted a hand, his thumb softly brushing a stray curl from her cheek. It wasn't a calculated test to see if she would flinch. It was a quiet, devoted promise. In the shadowed silence of his gilded cage, The terrifying Mafia boss was slowly becoming the only safe place she had ever known. The retaliation for the severed contract did not come wrapped in legal jargon. It came wrapped in lead. Hwang Joon-Seo had taken Layla to a private, syndicate-owned restaurant in the heart of the city, a quiet, deliberate display of her elevated status within his inner circle. They were stepping out of the VIP exit into a narrow, rain-slicked alleyway when the shadows violently tore open. The sharp pop of suppressed gunfire shattered the evening, instantly followed by the sickening crunch of bullets impacting the armored Maybach. Layla's breath caught, but before her mind could even process the ambush, a massive, unyielding weight crashed into her. Joon-Seo tackled her to the damp asphalt, burying her against his chest and shielding her entirely beneath his body as the brick wall behind them exploded into dust and stone shrapnel. Her family would have shoved her into the line of fire to buy themselves a handful of seconds. Joon-Seo became her armor. The quiet, calculating boss she had come to know vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by an apex predator completely unleashed. Moving with terrifying, mechanical precision, Joon-Seo drew his weapon and fired over Layla's head. Two bodies dropped heavily from the fire escape above. The damp air instantly choked with the sharp stench of cordite and copper. His security detail flooded the alleyway to suppress the remaining shooters, but Joon-Seo did not wait for the perimeter to be secured. He moved off Layla and hauled a surviving attacker out from behind a row of steel crates. It was a lieutenant bearing the unmistakable tattooed insignia of the scarred underboss. The man was bleeding and gasping, staring up at the Mafia boss with wide, terrified eyes. Layla pushed herself up against the Maybach's heavy tire, her pulse roaring in her ears. She watched as Joon-Seo pressed the smoking barrel of his weapon directly against the man's kneecap. Who gave the order to aim at the woman? Joon-Seo's voice wasn't a yell. It was a cold, hollow rasp that sounded like the grave itself. The man choked on a sob, spitting out a frantic confession and begging for mercy. Joon-Seo didn't blink. He pulled the trigger, shattering the joint, and as the man's screams echoed off the wet brick, Joon-Seo drove his heel into the assassin's throat, crushing the sound permanently. It was absolute, unadulterated brutality. It was the monster the Underworld whispered about, the ruthless executioner her father had sweated over in the boardroom. Yet, as Joon-Seo turned away from the corpse, his chest heaving, his dark eyes instantly sought Layla. He crossed the blood-slicked alley and dropped to his knees in front of her. His hands, stained with violence, hovered inches from her face, suddenly trembling with an agonizing restraint. He didn't check his own body for wounds. He searched her pale face, his gaze frantic, checking for a single scratch. Layla looked at the blood on his cuffs, then up into the eyes of a man who had just ripped the world apart for daring to threaten her. She didn't flinch away. For the first time in her life, she wasn't looking at a monster. She was looking at a shield. The armored Maybach returned to the estate in suffocating silence, the adrenaline of the alleyway slowly bleeding out into the heavy night air. Inside Joon-Seo's private quarters, the only sound was the soft ticking of the mantel clock and the rhythmic, harsh pull of his breathing. He stood by the massive mahogany desk, pouring a glass of scotch he didn't drink. His suit jacket was ruined, discarded somewhere in the foyer, leaving him in a torn, dirt-smudged dress shirt. Layla stood near the doorway, her pulse finally settling. She watched him flex his left hand, wincing imperceptibly as blood dripped from a deep, jagged gash along his forearm, shrapnel from the exploding brick wall he had shielded her from. He hadn't even mentioned it. He had been too busy tearing the Underworld apart to ensure she was entirely unscathed. In the Sterling household, weakness was punished and wounds were hidden. But as Layla looked at the ruthless Mafia boss bleeding quietly onto his Persian rug, the deeply ingrained instinct to keep her distance evaporated. She walked into his attached washroom, retrieved a sterile first aid kit from the glass cabinet, and returned to the study. She didn't ask for permission. She stepped directly into his space, the proximity an intimate shock to them both, and placed the kit on the desk. "Give me your arm," she said. Her voice was quiet, stripped of the defensive ice she usually wore like armor. Joon-Seo's dark eyes snapped to hers. The apex predator, who had just shattered a man's kneecap without blinking, now stared at her with a profound, hesitating vulnerability. Slowly, he extended his arm, relinquishing his absolute physical control to the woman he had taken to settle a debt. Layla's fingers were steady as she unbuttoned his cuff and rolled the ruined fabric past his elbow. As she pressed an antiseptic-soaked cloth to the gash, a sharp hiss escaped his teeth, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he stepped a fraction closer. The physical barrier between them, the invisible line dividing captive and captor, dissolved into the quiet space. "You didn't have to shield me," she murmured, keeping her focus on the wound as she carefully wiped away the blood. "My family would have left me in the alley to buy themselves time." Joon-Seo looked down at her, his gaze tracking the gentle, meticulous movement of her hands against his skin. His chest rose and fell in a heavy sigh, the coldness of his empire entirely eclipsed by the burning devotion settling into his bones. He reached out with his uninjured hand, his knuckles gently grazing the line of her jaw, tilting her chin up to force her to meet his eyes. "You are not a Sterling anymore, Layla," he rasped, his thumb brushing over her lower lip in a possessive, reverent caress. "You are mine. And I do not let the things that are mine bleed." The heavy calm that followed the alleyway ambush was a deceptive illusion. 2 days later, the storm finally broke, not with gunfire, but with a digitized map glowing violently red across the screens in Hwang Joon-Seo's underground command center. Layla stood beside the weathered advisor, her eyes tracking the blinking coordinates along the eastern seaboard. Since the night she bandaged Joon-Seo's arm, she had not been dismissed from his side. She was no longer a collateral pawn kept in the dark. She was an active, deeply observant participant in the architecture of his empire. Joon-Seo stood at the head of the glass table, his dark suit immaculate, but the lethal stillness in his posture radiated an absolute, freezing rage. "Confirm the source of the breach," Joon-Seo commanded, his voice barely above a whisper, yet it commanded the entire room's immediate obedience. The advisor typed rapidly. "It is a coordinated hijack, boss. 3 of our cargo ships passing through the northern strait have been intercepted by heavily armed maritime vessels. They are bypassing the encrypted channels." The older man paused, his weathered face tightening as he pulled up the registration of the intercepting fleet. He glanced cautiously at Layla. "The shell company chartering the rogue vessels traces back to the Sterling tech firm." Layla's breath hitched, but she forced her spine to remain perfectly rigid. Her brother, the golden child, desperate to regain the wealth their father had hemorrhaged, had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Denied the inside intelligence he had demanded through the burner phone she surrendered, her brother had grown impatient and greedy. He had blindly allied himself with the remnants of the scarred underboss's faction, attempting to steal Joon-Seo's shipments to fund his own desperate rise in the underworld. He believed Joon-Seo was distracted. He believed his sister's silence meant she was a broken, useless captive rather than a woman who had already chosen her side. The silence in the command center turned suffocating. Every operative's eyes flicked to Layla, waiting for the Mafia boss to turn his wrath upon the sister of the traitor. Joon-Seo slowly turned his head. His dark, penetrating gaze locked onto Layla. He did not yell. He did not draw a weapon. He simply studied her, searching the depths of her warm brown eyes for a single ounce of familial grief, panic, or lingering loyalty to the bloodline that had just declared war on him. Layla met his stare with an unflinching, absolute calm. She didn't beg for her brother's life. She didn't scramble to justify his staggering arrogance. "He is using the tech firm's secondary logistics grid to mask their approach," Layla stated, her voice slicing cleanly through the heavy tension. She stepped forward, pointing directly at the glowing red map. "Cut the power to their satellite uplinks through the corporate backdoor I identified last week. Blind them in the water." Joon-Seo's chest rose in a deep, steady breath. The freezing rage in his eyes melted into a dark, terrifying pride. His hand moved, his knuckles brushing the curve of her waist in a silent, possessive claim before he turned back to his men. Her brother had just signed his own death warrant, completely unaware that the executioner would be guided by the very sister he had thrown away. The digital map in the command center had long since faded to black, the rogue vessels neutralized and seized in the frigid Atlantic waters. But the true reckoning awaited in the suffocating quiet of Hwang Joon-Seo's private study. The heavy mahogany doors were sealed, isolating them from the syndicate's violent machinery. Joon-Seo stood by the crackling fireplace, the orange light casting sharp, predatory shadows across his tailored suit. Layla remained near the center of the Persian rug. The adrenaline of the tactical strike was receding, leaving behind the crushing weight of what her brother's treason truly meant. By syndicate law, an attack on the boss's fleet demanded the complete eradication of the offending bloodline. Her father, her brother, her golden sister, they were all forfeit. Joon-Seo did not pour a drink. He did not sit behind his massive desk. He crossed the room slowly, his dark eyes locked onto her with an intensity that made the air feel dangerously thin. He stopped inches away, the heat of his proximity a stark contrast to the cold calculation of his empire. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cupping the side of her face. His thumb traced her cheekbone, a gesture of profound devotion from a man who had previously only operated through absolute dominance. "My men have surrounded the Sterling estate," Joon-Seo stated, his voice a low, gravelly vibration in the silent room. "Your brother is currently secured in a warehouse by the docks. Your father is frantic, attempting to wire non-existent funds to buy his life a second time." He paused, his gaze searching her warm brown eyes. The moral shift within him was absolute. The ruthless Mafia boss was placing his ultimate vengeance in the hands of the woman he had initially taken as collateral. "I can end them tonight," he murmured softly. "Or I can let them live in exile, stripped of their wealth and their name. I am giving you the blade, Layla. What do you want me to do with your family?" Layla's breath hitched. For her entire life, the Sterlings had dictated her worth, treating her as a disposable shadow while they basked in their arrogance. They had sold her to a monster to save themselves, entirely blind to the fact that the monster would recognize her true value. She looked at the man standing before her, a protector who valued her brilliant mind and unyielding spirit above his own pride. "They sold me to survive, and then they tried to use me to steal from you," Layla said, her voice completely devoid of fear or pity. She didn't flinch away from his touch. She leaned into his palm, fully claiming her autonomy. "I owe them nothing. Strip them of the company. Take the ports. Leave them with nothing but the absolute certainty that the daughter they threw away is the reason they no longer exist." A dark, breathtaking smile touched the corners of Joon-Seo's mouth. The fierce control he wielded over the underworld had fully transitioned into an unwavering loyalty to her. He leaned down, pressing a lingering, reverent kiss to her forehead. The discarded daughter had just ordered the execution of her family's legacy, and the apex predator of the underworld was entirely hers to command. The Grand Solstice Gala was the underworld's glittering masquerade, a night where blood money bought champagne and territorial wars were fought with razor-sharp smiles. Held in the cavernous ballroom of a syndicate-owned hotel, the room was a sea of bespoke tuxedos, dripping diamonds, and lethal calculations. Layla stood at the top of the sweeping grand staircase, the suffocating weight of the Sterling name finally shed. She wore a floor-length gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her silhouette like a second skin, her dark coils pinned elegantly atop her head. She was no longer the forgotten daughter traded to settle a desperate man's debt. She was the architect of her family's absolute ruin, stepping into the light on her own terms. Beside her, Hwang Joon-Seo was a portrait of terrifying elegance. Dressed in a stark black tuxedo, he radiated a cold, gravitational dominance that commanded the massive ballroom before he even descended a single step. When he offered Layla his arm, it was not a polite, high society gesture, it was a possessive tether, a silent warning broadcasted to every predator in the room. As they began their descent, the dull roar of conversation fractured, then died entirely. Hundreds of calculating eyes shifted upward. The whisper network ignited instantly. They knew exactly who she was. The disgraced Sterling daughter. The collateral. The pawn whose family had just been surgically eradicated from the financial map in less than 48 hours. The vipers in the room expected her to look broken, trailing behind the Mafia boss with her eyes cast down to the marble floor in submission. Instead, Layla kept her chin perfectly level. Her warm brown eyes swept over the crowd with the icy, analytical precision she had honed in the shadows of her father's house. She did not shrink under the weight of their judgment. She assessed them right back. Joon-Seo's hand slid from her arm to rest firmly at the small of her back, the heat of his palm a burning, protective anchor. As they reached the ballroom floor, the sea of elites parted instinctively. A rival boss from the Western District, a man who had gleefully profited from the Sterling Empire's collapse, stepped forward, a mocking, predatory smile stretching across his face. He opened his mouth, clearly intending to publicly diminish the woman he perceived as Joon-Seo's disposable plaything. Joon-Seo didn't even break his stride. He shifted his stance, moving fractionally to eclipse Layla from the man's line of sight, his dark eyes flashing with a violent, unyielding promise. The silent threat radiating from the syndicate boss was absolute. Speak to her, and you will not leave this room breathing. The rival's mocking smile dissolved into pale, sweating caution as he quickly stepped back into the crowd. Joon-Seo guided Layla to the very center of the room, effortlessly taking 2 glasses of champagne from a trembling waiter. He handed one to her, turning his back on the most dangerous people in the city to focus entirely on the woman in front of him. In front of the entire underworld, the ruthless king did not just parade a captive. He crowned his equal, his unwavering devotion silencing the vipers in a single, masterful stroke. The champagne flutes had barely been emptied when Hwang Joon-Seo was briefly intercepted by a syndicate elder. He did not step far, his dark eyes never truly leaving Layla, but the 2 yards of space were enough for the vipers to strike. A woman in a crimson gown materialized beside Layla. She was the matriarch of the southern smuggling routes, a woman who had spent decades clawing her way to the top of a brutal hierarchy, and she looked upon Joon-Seo's new companion with naked, venomous disdain. She offered a smile that resembled a drawn blade. "It is a fascinating strategy," the woman purred, her gaze raking over Layla's midnight blue silk. "Hwang has always been an immaculate collector of assets. But bringing the bankrupt Sterling girl to the Solstice Gala? It is like wearing costume jewelry to a diamond exchange. Tell me, do you know how quickly he liquidates investments that lose their novelty once the debt is settled?" Layla did not flinch. Her blood relatives had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of the veiled insult. This underworld matriarch was simply using a louder volume. Layla slowly turned her crystal glass by the stem, her warm brown eyes meeting the older woman's predatory stare with absolute, chilling calm. "An interesting analogy," Layla replied, her voice smooth and entirely devoid of intimidation. "Though I find it bold coming from a woman whose southern shipping routes are currently hemorrhaging 30% of their gross revenue due to a staggering reliance on outdated customs bribes." The matriarch's crimson smile faltered, her posture instantly stiffening. The surrounding elite, lingering close enough to eavesdrop on the anticipated slaughter, fell into a breathless hush. Layla took a measured step closer, invading the woman's personal space with the exact terrifying grace she had learned from the man watching her from across the room. "You are bleeding capital from your secondary logistics grid," Layla stated quietly, her tone surgical and merciless. "You masked it well in your quarterly ledgers, but your offshore accounts are drowning in tariffs you cannot cover. You didn't approach me to mock my family's bankruptcy. You approached me because you are terrified that the man standing 10 feet away already knows about yours." The older woman's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, but the sharp, cruel retorts had been completely vaporized by the sheer, terrifying accuracy of Layla's financial autopsy. Before the matriarch could scrape together a retreat, a heavy, suffocating warmth materialized at Layla's back. Joon-Seo's large hand settled possessively on the curve of her waist. He did not look at the humiliated rival boss. He looked only at Layla, his dark eyes burning with a fierce, ruinous pride. The underworld had expected a broken pawn. Instead, they watched the apex predator of the Korean Mafia lean in close, his physical devotion acting as an absolute shield for the brilliant, unyielding woman who had just drawn blood without ever raising her voice. The estate was submerged in the heavy, breathless silence that only settles at 3 in the morning. Far below the master suite, the syndicate's nocturnal machinery hummed, but inside Hwang Joon-Seo's private quarters, the world had narrowed to the space between 2 people. The armor of the gala had been discarded. Layla's midnight silk gown pulled over the back of a velvet chair, and she stood near the towering glass windows wrapped in one of Joon-Seo's heavy dress shirts. The sleeves swallowed her hands, the fabric carrying the intoxicating scent of sandalwood and gunmetal. Joon-Seo stood a few feet away, his tuxedo jacket and tie long gone. His collar was unbuttoned, revealing the faint edge of a scar along his collarbone. The lethal, freezing authority he wielded in the ballroom had evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked profoundly, beautifully exhausted by the weight of his own empire. He poured 2 glasses of aged scotch, walked over, and handed her one. Their fingers brushed. The spark of contact was no longer a calculated test of her flinch reflex. It was a deep, undeniable gravitational pull. "They looked at you tonight and saw their own obsolescence," Joon-Seo murmured, his voice a low, rough vibration in the quiet room. He didn't look at the sprawling city lights beyond the glass. He looked only at her. "Your father offered you to me as a sacrifice." He thought he was handing a lamb to a slaughterhouse. Layla traced the rim of her crystal glass, her warm brown eyes lifting to meet his. The hardened shell she had built to survive her family's neglect was entirely gone, exposing the quiet, fiercely loyal heart beneath. "I thought so, too," she confessed softly. "I expected a cage. I expected to be broken until I was as hollow as the debts they owed you." Joon-Seo stepped closer, taking the glass from her hand and setting both drinks aside on the sill. He closed the remaining distance, his large hands coming up to gently frame her face. The stark power imbalance that had defined their first meeting was completely rewritten. He was the apex predator of the underworld, but in the dark of his room, he was laying his absolute devotion at her feet. "I took you to gut your family's pride," he admitted, his thumbs sweeping over her cheekbones in a slow, reverent caress. "But from the moment you looked at me in that boardroom without a single trace of begging, you became the only thing in this life I cannot afford to lose." Layla leaned into his touch, her hands coming to rest flat against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart. He leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. In the suffocating world of blood and betrayal, they had found their absolute anchor. They stood together in the quiet dark, entirely unaware that miles away, the surviving Sterlings were striking a match to burn it all down. The illusion of peace shattered not with a gunshot, but with a quiet, desperate handshake in the cavernous belly of an abandoned shipyard. Richard Sterling, stripped of his ports, his pride, and his golden sun, stood trembling in a damp trench coat. He was no longer the arrogant patriarch who had confidently bargained his daughter's life away in a pristine boardroom. He was a cornered animal, bleeding out in the dark, and cornered animals made catastrophic alliances. Across from him stood the scarred underboss, his fractured kneecap supported by a heavy steel cane. The rival faction had been decimated by Hwang Joon-Seo's wrath in the alleyway, but they had not been entirely erased. They shared a mutual, burning hatred for the man who had dismantled their empires, but more importantly, they shared a revelation. He paraded her at the solstice gala, the scarred man hissed, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "The monster of the eastern seaboard didn't take your daughter as a hostage, Sterling. He took her as a queen. She is the only pulse he has left." Richard's jaw tightened, a sickening cocktail of greed and resentment twisting his stomach. The daughter he had deemed worthless, the shadow he had thrown to the wolves, was now the untouchable center of the Korean Mafia. The realization did not breed remorse, it bred a lethal, suffocating envy. If Joon-Seo valued Layla above his own syndicate, then her presence was no longer a shield, it was his ultimate vulnerability. They drafted the ambush in the shadows. They knew Joon-Seo's security grid was impenetrable from the outside, but Richard Sterling possessed one final, toxic asset, the architectural blueprints to the estate's underground utility network, procured years ago during a corporate real estate acquisition he had hidden from the syndicate. It was a microscopic blind spot, but for a coalition of desperate rivals, it was enough to slip a dagger into the heart of the beast. They planned to draw Joon-Seo out to the docks with a decoy shipment, leaving the estate exposed to a surgical strike aimed directly at his inner circle. Miles away, inside the gilded cage that had become her sanctuary, Layla sat across from the weathered advisor in the study. The morning sun cast long, peaceful rays across the mahogany desk, but the older man's posture was suddenly rigid. He pressed a hand to his earpiece, his weathered face draining of color as a frantic stream of encrypted static flooded the communication channel. Joon-Seo had left the estate an hour prior to inspect the western docks. "The perimeter sensors haven't been tripped," the advisor said, his voice dropping into a deadly, urgent rasp as he drew a heavy sidearm from his coat. He looked at Layla, the terrifying realization settling over them both simultaneously. "But the internal pressure in the lower sublevels is dropping. We are being breached from below." Before Layla could stand, the heavy oak doors of the study violently shuddered, and the estate's power grid abruptly flatlined, plunging the room into absolute, suffocating darkness. The absolute darkness of the study was instantly shattered by the deafening roar of a localized explosive breaching the lower levels. The floorboards violently trembled beneath Layla's feet, the concussive wave rattling the glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. A second later, emergency crimson lighting flickered to life along the baseboards, casting the room in a blood-red, suffocating glow. "Stay behind the desk," the weathered advisor ordered, his gravelly voice stripping away any pretense of calm. He chambered around with a sharp, metallic clack, moving with lethal efficiency to drag a heavy bronze statue in front of the locked oak doors. Layla did not cower. Her blood relatives had sent a strike team to slaughter the only people who had ever truly valued her, expecting her to be a paralyzed, weeping victim trapped in the crossfire. Instead, her mind sharpened into a cold, tactical weapon. She moved swiftly behind the massive mahogany desk, her eyes sweeping the dim room not for a place to hide, but for leverage. Acrid black smoke began to curl beneath the door frame, filling the study with the suffocating scent of burning wire and sulfur. Outside in the corridor, the chaotic symphony of suppressed gunfire and shouting echoed as Joon-Seo's remaining estate guards engaged the invaders. But the attackers were overwhelming the skeleton crew. Layla Sterling had sold them the exact blueprints to bypass the heaviest security cordons. "They are coming up the private stairwell," the advisor grunted, taking a defensive stance aimed directly at the center of the wood panels. "The boss is 15 minutes out. We only have to hold the room." A heavy, rhythmic thudding pounded against the other side of the door. Then, a voice bled through the wood, arrogant, breathless, and sickeningly familiar. Her brother. "Layla," he shouted over the crackle of burning drywall. "Tell the old man to open the door and you get to walk out of this alive. The Hwang Empire is burning." Layla's chest tightened, but the lingering ghost of childhood fear was instantly eclipsed by a freezing, absolute rage. He was standing in the ashes of Joon-Seo's sanctuary, weaponizing her name to orchestrate a slaughter. "Don't shoot," Layla whispered to the advisor, her voice razor-thin but perfectly steady. She stepped out from behind the desk, her silhouette catching the crimson emergency lights. "If you fire through the door, they will breach with explosives and kill us both." The advisor's weathered eyes snapped to her, his gun still raised. He didn't see a hostage. He saw the cold, unyielding architecture of a syndicate queen calculating her next move. "What are you doing?" "Buying the 15 minutes, Layla replied. She walked toward the burning oak, the heat radiating against her skin, and raised her voice over the chaos. "I'm here. Tell your men to stand down, and I will unlock the deadbolt." The advisor tensed, but Layla met his gaze with absolute certainty. She wasn't surrendering. She was drawing her brother into a fatal bottleneck, using her family's terminal underestimation of her as the ultimate weapon. The heavy oak door shuddered again, the wood groaning under the weight of the assault. "Stand your men down," Layla shouted, her voice slicing through the thick, acrid smoke. "If you blow the hinges, the crossfire will kill me. Give me 1 minute to clear the lock." Silence fell on the corridor, punctuated only by the crackle of distant flames. Her brother's voice bled through, dripping with the arrogant certainty that had always defined their bloodline. "You have 60 seconds, Layla. Step out, and you come home. The Sterling name is yours again. We have the extraction chopper waiting." It was the ultimate out. A golden ticket back to the life she had been brutally torn from, an offer of safety wrapped in the familiar, suffocating illusion of family. For a fraction of a second, the terrified girl who had grown up hiding in the shadows of their mansion remembered what it felt like to crave their approval. But that girl had died the moment Hwang Joon-Seo looked at her across a boardroom and recognized her worth. She was no longer a pawn desperate for a seat at their table. She was the architect of their ruin. The moral shift within her was absolute. Layla turned her back on the burning door. She didn't reach for the deadbolt. Instead, she rushed to the massive mahogany desk, her eyes locking onto the leather-bound tablet resting near the Scotch glasses. It was the master ledger. Within its encrypted drives lay the entirety of Joon-Seo's Eastern Empire, the offshore routing numbers, the corrupt politicians in his pocket, the identities of his most lethal lieutenants. If the Sterlings breached the room and seized it, Joon-Seo's physical survival wouldn't matter. His kingdom would be dismantled overnight. The weathered advisor watched her, his gun leveled at the wood, his eyes widening as he realized her intent. Layla grabbed a heavy bronze paperweight from the desk. She didn't attempt to guess the password or wipe the servers cleanly. She raised the bronze and brought it down with terrifying, calculated violence, shattering the tablet's reinforced glass screen. She struck it again and again, driving the metal through the motherboard until the device warped and sparked, completely obliterating the localized hardware. "What are you doing?" her brother yelled from the hall, the sound of the shattering glass echoing through the smoke. "Open the door." Layla swept the ruined tablet into the roaring fireplace, watching the flames instantly consume the lithium and plastic, melting Joon-Seo's vulnerabilities into unrecognizable ash. She stood before the hearth, the fire casting her face in a fierce, golden light. She had just trapped herself in a burning room with a hit squad, actively choosing the dangerous, devoted Mafia boss over the treacherous safety of her blood. She had burned her only bridge, cementing her irrevocable rise from a discarded daughter to the fiercely loyal queen of a dark empire. "Time is up," she whispered to the ashes, just as the heavy thud of helicopter rotors shifted from an extraction rhythm to the terrifying, heavy beat of Joon-Seo's returning gunships. The heavy beat of the gunship rotors vibrated through the floorboards, drowning out the crackle of the burning estate. Outside the study doors, the arrogant shouting of Layla's brother abruptly warped into frantic, disorganized panic. The Sterling strike team had assumed they were breaching a vulnerable cage. They hadn't realized the apex predator had already returned to seal the exits. Gunfire erupted in the corridor, not the suppressed, rhythmic popping of a tactical assault, but the deafening, brutal roar of absolute annihilation. Layla stood motionless by the roaring fireplace, the melted remnants of the master ledger turning to ash behind her. The weathered advisor lowered his weapon slightly, his posture relaxing from a defensive stance into one of grim reverence. The king had arrived. A body was violently thrown against the heavy oak doors, the wood splintering under the impact. Then, the barricade was kicked open with terrifying force. Hwang Joon-Seo stepped over the threshold, a silhouette forged in blood and smoke. His pristine suit was stained with the immediate aftermath of slaughter, his chest heaving, his weapon drawn. He did not look at the advisor. He did not look at the carnage he had dragged into the hallway. His dark, frantic eyes swept the crimson-lit room until they locked onto Layla. The freezing, calculating monster of the underworld was entirely gone, replaced by a man who had just torn his own city apart to reach her. He crossed the ruined study in 3 massive strides, dropping his weapon to the floor. He didn't ask if she was hurt. He pulled her into his chest with a crushing, desperate grip, burying his face in her hair. The smell of gunmetal, smoke, and sandalwood enveloped her, a violently protective shield. "You're alive," he rasped, the words tearing from his throat like a jagged confession. For a man who owned everything, the realization that he had almost lost the only woman who saw him clearly shattered his final defenses. Layla wrapped her arms around his waist, her hardened shell melting completely against his racing heartbeat. She looked over his shoulder. In the corridor, 2 of Joon-Seo's lieutenants dragged her brother into the doorway. The golden sun was bleeding, disarmed, and weeping in stark terror. He looked at Layla not as a disposable sister, but as the untouchable queen of the empire he had just failed to conquer. Joon-Seo pulled back slightly, his hands framing her face as his eyes tracked her gaze to the doorway. He took in the shattered bronze and the melted tablet in the hearth, instantly understanding the massive, irreversible choice she had made. She had burned her bridge to her bloodline to protect his reign. He turned toward her brother, the desperate devotion in his eyes hardening back into an unforgiving, lethal promise. The blood price for threatening his queen had just been calculated, and Joon-Seo was about to collect every single drop. The ashes of the breached estate had barely cooled when Hwang Joon-Seo dragged the surviving Sterlings back to the exact place their fatal miscalculation had begun. The custom black marble table of the penthouse boardroom was cold, reflecting the terrified, bruised faces of Richard Sterling and his golden son. They were bound to the leather chairs, stripped of their bespoke suits and their arrogance, surrounded by the syndicate's heavily armed elite. The heavy doors opened with a final, echoing click. Joon-Seo walked in, his pristine black suit replaced by dark tactical wear that still carried the faint scent of smoke and gunpowder. But he did not take the head of the table. He stood back, his hand resting possessively, devotedly, at the base of Layla's spine as he guided her to the seat of absolute power. Layla wore a dark coat draped over her shoulders, untouched by the fire she had stood within to protect his empire. She sat at the head of the marble table, looking down at the men who had spent her entire life convincing her she was a worthless shadow. "The accounts are frozen," the weathered advisor announced from the corner, his tablet glowing in the dim room. "The Cayman shells have been liquidated. The tech firm's servers are wiped, and the physical ports have been permanently transferred to the Hwang syndicate. The Sterling name holds zero equity." Richard Sterling choked on a desperate breath, his eyes darting frantically to the Mafia boss. "Joon-Seo, please." It was the boy's greed. "I didn't authorize the strike. I gave you the girl to settle the debt." Joon-Seo's expression was carved from ice. He stepped forward, leaning his hands flat on the marble, looming over the broken patriarch. "You did not give me a girl," he rasped, his voice vibrating with a lethal, absolute devotion. "You handed me the architect of your own destruction. And you are no longer speaking to me." He turned his head slightly, his dark eyes locking onto Layla with profound reverence. "You are speaking to her." Richard stared at his forgotten daughter. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. She wasn't a hostage pleading for her life. She was the queen of the eastern seaboard, holding the blade to his throat. "You built this family on the belief that I was disposable," Layla stated, her voice smooth, chilling, and completely devoid of pity. "You sold me to a monster to save your own skin, completely blind to the fact that the monster would be the first person to ever see my true value." She stood, a picture of ultimate, terrifying grace. "Your empire's gone, Richard. And I want you to spend the rest of your miserable, bankrupt life knowing that the daughter you threw away is the one who burned it down." Joon-Seo's chest rose in a slow, deep breath. The dominance that had defined his reign was entirely eclipsed by a fierce, yielding pride. He offered Layla his hand, leading her out of the boardroom and leaving the Sterling legacy to suffocate in the dark. The skyline of the city glittered like scattered diamonds beneath the sweeping balcony of their new penthouse, far above the ashes of the Sterling Empire. The war was over. The blood debt had been paid not in currency, but in the absolute destruction of the people who had dared to treat Layla as disposable collateral. She stood at the edge of the glass railing, the cold night wind catching the heavy silk of her robe. She was no longer a shadow hiding in the corners of her father's house. She was the architect of her own fate, the untouchable queen of a syndicate that had bowed to her brilliance. Behind her, the quiet, deliberate footsteps of Hwang Joon-Seo echoed on the marble floor. He did not approach her with the terrifying, suffocating authority that had defined their first meeting in the boardroom. The apex predator of the Korean underworld had been entirely dismantled by the woman standing before him. He stepped onto the balcony, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and pulling her back against the solid, unyielding warmth of his chest. Layla leaned into his embrace, her hands resting over his where they locked across her stomach. The profound power imbalance that had once caged her had completely inverted. He was the king who commanded armies in the dark, but in the quiet spaces between the wars, he belonged entirely to her. "The Elder Council finalized the transfer of the eastern ports this morning," Joon-Seo murmured, his voice a low, rough vibration against her ear. He pressed a lingering kiss to her temple, his breath warm against her skin. "They requested your signature on the routing ledgers, not mine. They know exactly whose mind holds this empire together." Layla turned in his arms, her warm brown eyes meeting his. The man who had once demanded her as payment now looked at her with a fierce, ruinous devotion that bordered on worship. He lifted his hand, his callous thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw, no longer a test of her fear, but a reverent acknowledgement of her strength. "I was supposed to be the pawn they sacrificed to save themselves," Layla whispered, a soft, triumphant smile touching her lips. "I was supposed to break." Joon-Seo's dark eyes burned with an intensity that eclipsed the city lights. He slowly lowered himself, dropping to one knee on the cold marble. The most dangerous man on the eastern seaboard took her hand, pressing his lips to her knuckles in a breathtaking display of absolute, willing submission. "They sent a pawn to a slaughterhouse," Joon-Seo rasped, looking up at her with unwavering loyalty. "And instead, they gave me my queen. You will never walk in the shadows again, Layla. The world is yours to command, and I am simply the sword you wield." Layla looked down at the Mafia boss kneeling at her feet. She had been rejected by her blood, but in the arms of the monster, she had finally found her throne. The architecture of power is rarely built on the foundations we are taught to believe in. Society, much like the Sterling bloodline, operates under the dangerous illusion that value is determined by pedigree, by the loudness of one's arrogance, and by the sheer force used to break the people beneath them. But the underworld, for all its brutality and blood, understands a much colder, purer truth. The most dangerous element in any room is never the golden child standing in the light. It is the shadow cast aside, watching from the dark. When a person is consistently rejected, when they are starved of warmth and taught that they are entirely disposable, they do not simply break. If they survive, they calcify. They build fortresses out of their own isolation. Layla Sterling was handed to a monster as a hollow sacrifice, expected to shatter against the stone walls of a mafia empire. Instead, she arrived with an unbreakable resilience forged in the very fires her family used to burn her. Those who are overlooked learn to see everything. Those who are silenced learn to listen to the whispers that topple kingdoms. Hwang Joon-Seo ruled his territory through absolute, suffocating control. He commanded obedience through terror, a dominator who believed that fear was the only reliable currency. But fear is fragile. It shatters the moment a greater terror enters the room. True, unassailable power does not lie in holding a blade to someone's throat to force their submission. It lies in the profound, moral shift of dropping the blade entirely and earning their absolute devotion. By recognizing Layla's sharp intellect and unyielding spirit, Joon-Seo did not weaken his empire. He anchored it. His redemption was not found in abandoning his darkness, but in bending that darkness to fiercely protect the woman who saw the man beneath the monster. The transition from a cold captor to a fiercely devoted partner became his ultimate victory, proving that a king is only as untouchable as the queen standing beside him. The Sterling family fell because they believed worth was assigned by a name. They suffocated under the weight of their own arrogance. But Layla experienced a complete rise in value because worth is inherent, waiting only for the right eyes to see it. In the end, the most formidable empires are not sustained by those who were handed the crown, but by the rejected, the unseen, and the underestimated, who finally realize it is their time to rule. If you live for intense moral shifts and a ruthless king who bows only to his queen, make sure to add this story to your library. Vote on this chapter and tell me in the comments which moment of Joon-Seo's redemption arc was your absolute favorite. Follow my profile for more stories where the forgotten shadows finally claim their crowns.